So our next speaker loves Perl. Not the language, but the object. Because he must collect 1 million of them before he is allowed back into the ocean to be with his family. One time he showed me his collection. He was almost finished. He was so excited to go home, and I slapped him out of his hand so it fell into a street grate. So now he has to stay up here forever and give talks at conferences. Since then, he's been wandering alone and sad until someone asked his name for a random PDX survey on the street corner, and he didn't have a name at time because he was a merman. So he just told him the first thing that came to mind, which was blank. And therefore, we have David blank Edelman.
So now I know what it's like to have one of these introductions, and you spend the first 5 minutes you're talking, wait, is that all true? So hi, my name is David blank Edelman. Good morning. Oh, come on, I know there's a cannabis store just across the way. Let's try that again. Good morning.
Good morning.
Excellent. So, hi, I'm the technical evangelist at a company called Apcera. If you haven't heard of us, we make this cool software that allows you to run whatever you want in a public cloud or on-prem, and we put a nice policy engine in the middle of it that makes DevOps people happy, but we're not going to talk about any of that right now. What I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about DevOps versus SRE. So, I was, and this is a totally made-up story, but work with me. I was at a yard sale where I discovered this comic book called DevOps versus SRE, and I had to pick it up because I'm a big fan of comic books. Anyone who's heard me speak before knows that I love comic books. I love all sorts of, okay, we're going to be tapping this instead of that. I love all sorts of characters, the standard superheroes and superheroines and those people that are not on the binary spectrum, not on the gender binary, Spider-Man, The Flash, I don't know, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern. Anybody here know who Dr. Fate is? I just want to make sure. Can you speak up? Yell out if you know who Dr. Fate is. Yeah, okay, good. So now it was just a fun one from my childhood, but I love not just sort of the traditional ones. I really, really love the comic book heroes that nobody's ever heard of that are bad. Like, for example, maybe you've heard of Captain Marvel. Raise your hand if you've heard of Captain Marvel. Okay, now the Captain Marvel you're thinking of, I'm assuming that's the Captain Marvel done by MF Enterprise, where the character would say, split, and all of his arms and legs would go flying off to hit the bad guys. Right, and then he would say Zam, and they would come back together. And right, that's the Captain Marvel you're thinking of? Because that's my favorite Captain Marvel. Or maybe Matter Eater Lad, who can do what? Come on. That's right, eat anything he wants. That's right. And this is he used to travel with Blockade Boy, because you can guess what Blockade Boy does. And truly one of my favorites of all times is Squirrel Girl. Okay, who knows Squirrel Girl, right? Eat nuts, kick butts, right? So Squirrel Girl is this really awesome character who actually goes up against some of the worst baddies in the world and beats them. And she has prehensile tail, and she has a bunch of squirrel friends who follow her around and do what she asks. In fact, that utility belt, too much fun, used to be called her nutsacks. Just saying. Anyway, so I love Squirrel Girl. She's awesome. And my very favorite one that perhaps nobody here has ever heard of is the Red Bee. I love the Red Bee so much. The Red Bee's only superpower is that he would travel around with a trained bee. So this thing says, I've heard of your work, Mr. Red Bee, but it ends right here. Maybe. Stealthily, the Red Bee opens a catch in his belt and releases a bee. Ow, a bee stung me. You're number one on the hit parade. I love this, right? And I just recently found out, by the way, the bee's name, and you can go back if someone asks you at your company, what did you learn at DevOps Days? The name of the bee was Michael. I'm not making that up. That's totally true. I don't know what you're thinking. Wait a second. What were we talking about? Okay, right. Sorry. Let's come back to what we're actually talking about. So, in order for me to talk about DevOps versus SRE, one of the things that I have to sort of get out of my system is, in the early days of DevOps, and I really appreciated Nell's talks, one of the things that used to rankle people who were sysadmins, and I've been in the sysadmin, DevOps, SRE world for about 30 years now, was a picture that looked a little bit like this. Right, that was like, there was the sysadmin who was the monkey over here, and now we've evolved, and the evolved version of sysadmins are DevOps, right? Right, and that's, I don't buy that. And now there's this notion like, oh, okay, that's cool. Now you start up as the sysadmin, and then you eventually become an SRE. Or now here's the more controversial version of this, I suppose. is, DevOps, but DevOps are going to now evolve to SRE. And I think this, quite frankly, just to be clear about this, is I truly think that this stuff is all just junk. Right? So I'm not suggesting that anybody is better than anybody else. We're just going to look at the different things because both of them are basically trying to deal with one problem. There's this tug of war that Nell mentioned between sort of the developers in an environment and an operations people. Developers, largely for their living, they produce software. Their job is to create cool things, make software. And, as part of that, their job is to release new software, to improve, to make new versions. But as we all know that when you make new versions of things, you get new bugs and stuff like that. So that brings you over sort of to the land of the people on the ops side, whose job it is to make sure that this software runs reliably and can be available. And so on their side, it is better if things didn't change and stayed up all the time. And yet on the other side, there's the hey, my job is to go off and make software and keep on reloading stuff. And if you want here, we'll make it more superhero-y, okay? If that helps any. So it's this tension that sort of two strains in the world, at least two strains of people or tribes, whatever you want to call them in the world, came about. There's the sort of DevOps people and the SRE people. We're going to talk about both. But largely, when I get to the DevOps stuff, because we're at DevOps Days, what I'm going to do is spend very little time on telling you what DevOps is. In fact, I might have two slides, or one slide about what DevOps is, because if you've been to DevOps Days, you've heard that talk again and again and again. And as soon as somebody puts up a slide that says DevOps is, you want to start clawing your eyes out because you've heard this before. And so I'm going to be super quick about it. This is I think the really lovely definition. Cultural and organizational shift, specifically around the relationship between Dev and Ops. Yay! If you want to read about this, go look on Wikipedia. It's a lovely thing. And just to get it out of my system, I want to just be clear that DevOps is not, in my opinion, a product. I love the vendors, but it is not a product. It is not a process. It is not a certification, but now people will sell that to you. It's not a destination. You're not, I think tomorrow, if the wind holds up, we'll get to DevOps. Is not the case. A job title, you're not a DevOps. I'm pretty clear that you're not sort of a shampoo, a four wax, or a salad dressing. I think it shows up there. And I also want to say that to my mind, when you hear about this stuff, it reminds me a lot of the Gil Scott-Heron tune, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." So if I play this piece and you stick DevOps in every time they say revolution, you're going to... Whoa, sorry.
Revolution will not give your mouth sex appeal. The revolution will not get rid of the nub. The revolution will not make you look 5 pounds thinner because the revolution will not be televised, brother.
If you don't actually know this song, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, you need to go find it immediately. It's really great. Okay, so, I think that this sort of stuff that we're talking about has been effectively covered by Effective DevOps. In fact, we have one of the authors in the room, and it is an awesome book. From that book, I saw stuff like these two acronyms that I liked a lot. This COMS acronym, which talks about collaboration or culture, depending which way you look at it. Automation, you'll see why this is in red in a moment. Lean or learning, depending on who you are. Measurement and sharing are all really super important things to the DevOps world. Or if you like, there's another acronym, CATS, collaboration, affinity, tools, and scaling. Right, that's the one you like better? Somebody's clapping. So I'm going to leave the land of DevOps because you're going to have 2 days worth of DevOps stuff. I want to get into the land of SRE just so we get there. And look, it's SRE. Okay, does anybody in this room know what SRE stands for? The vast majority, some of you. Do people in here not know the term SRE? Okay, cool. So there's a bunch of you who don't know that. So SRE is a title or a name of a group or a field, depending on which you look at it, that was invented once upon a time at Google that stands for Site Reliability Engineering. And just to give you a quick disclaimer, I tech edited this book. I have written a book for O'Reilly, and I have a blurb in it, so I have some say in this, but I think it's a really good book nonetheless. And the idea that was, once upon a time, in the beginning of Google, this is at least their origin story. Whether it's true or not, I can't promise you. This gentleman right here, Ben Treynor, decided to build a different kind of ops group, one that was built, in his opinion, on certain engineering principles, and that would do stuff differently. It would also be focused on that key word right in the middle, R, reliability. His notion was that you can build the best service in the world that can have the most features, but if it's not reliable, it's not going to be useful. So things like cough, Pokemon Go, cough, things like that. You can have an awesome Pokemon Go client, but if the servers don't work, nobody wants it. I take it back. People seem to want it nonetheless, but But you know what I'm saying. And if you see any up here while I'm talking, please wait till the end of the talk. That's all I ask before you come up here. So the notion was that there would be a focus on reliability. Now, the book that I showed you a moment ago from O'Reilly is really good. To my mind, the very best explanation of what SRE is and where it comes from the talk that he gave at the first SRE conference. So another disclaimer, I helped found SRECon. I think it's a great conference and you should check it out. But what I want to say about that is at the very first talk, he put up this slide that had 18 different things that composed what he thought SRE was. I have done a dramatic recreation of his slide. It looks like this, roughly. You don't have to read all this because we're going to go through parts of this together. But this is approximately the slide that he put up. I didn't get his actual slide yet because Google doesn't really release their slides. Okay. So here are the things I want to talk about that I think that will be useful to you as people thinking about DevOps and what can be taken from SRE land. The first three things that were out there are perhaps obvious to you, but maybe not. One was to have an SLA for your service, have a service level agreement that says, we're going to come to some understanding on how do I tell whether your service is reliable. Is it up? Is it working? Is it a certain amount of transactions per second? Is it this? We're going to come to some agreement. And you and I are all going to agree on what it means to be working. Not only that, we're also going to come to an agreement that says, how much does it have to be up? Because you know, the truth of it is that most services and most pieces of software in this world don't have to be working 100% of the time. You can have some maintenance downtime, etc. Now, the flight computer on the plane, not so much. The medical device, not so much. But if your service or your thing goes down for an hour or 2 hours a year, probably okay, you know, at the right time if announced. So the notion is that what we would do is then we would measure, report this performance. We would have really good monitoring that would tell us just how, you know, given those the way we represent whether it's up or not, how reliable it is, how up has it been. And once we've got that notion of just how much it has been operational and working, then we know how we have a certain number. So we might say, oh, well, it's been down in the last quarter 0.1% of the time. And congratulations, if that is within your SLA that says it can be down that long, you now have an error budget. You have this budget that says, I'm allowed to take it down for this amount, or I'm allowed to perturb the service enough such that its reliability drops just to where we both agreed that that would be allowed. And that's an error budget, right? This notion that says, and I think it's kind of brilliant, and this is an error budget, it's not related, but I thought it was cool from the Hubble Space Telescope. But an error budget is this notion that says, okay, you developers, you development team, you can go ahead and do whatever you want to your software as long as, and you can deploy as much as you want, as long as it doesn't drop below a certain level of reliability that we've agreed upon. And if it has, and you have used up your entire error budget, well, then you can spend the next quarter trying to make it more reliable, so next quarter you won't have this problem. Okay, and it's a sort of a nice virtuous system that suggests that everybody has everyone has agreement as to what is okay to have happen, and everyone has an understanding about what they're working towards, and they're all working towards towards a direct goal that everybody agrees on. Okay. Now, other stuff that's kind of cool over in SRE land is the notion that you should be taking your SREs, your whatever you want to call them, and your dev people from the same pool, which means that a development team gets to decide whether they want more developers or more SREs. But the cool thing is that if, in fact, whatever the service is, if the amount of operational work, the amount of tickets, that sort of stuff, exceeds a certain amount, in this particular case, it's capped at 50%, then what will happen is those tickets will no longer go to the SREs, they will go to the devs. And you are aware of this really wonderful phenomenon that says the first time that a developer is paged at 2 a.m. for a bug, or maybe the third time that developer is paged at 2 a.m. for a bug, is the last time that bug shows up in your system. It's the same idea here that says basically if you have excess operational load and it goes to the developers, they will work very hard to make sure that the operational load goes down. So it's another one of these sort of virtuous systems that I think makes sense. And finally, right, I keep on remembering this is not functional. And finally, from this slide, this is something that's also shown up in the DevOps community as well that I'm particularly happy about. The notion is that when you have events, when you have downtimes or whatever, however you define event, you should be doing a post-mortem. You should be getting people in the room to sit in the room to figure out what happened, what failed, and how did you know, when did it happen, what is the timeline, what was the cause for that sort of stuff. And the key thing about those post-mortems is they need to be blameless. It can't be a big blame festival. It can't be, well, Bob screwed up again, didn't he? Because it is the case that you can't have a situation where it is possible to fire enough people to make your service reliable. Right? I mean, like, there's some notion in this culture that says, hey, Bob screwed up healthcare.gov. We're going to fire Bob, and now suddenly healthcare.gov is more reliable. It doesn't really work that way. The idea is to try to learn a lesson, and specifically learn a lesson on what failed in your processes and in your technology that you can improve upon. That's the key thing, not to blame who did what when, and to look at that. Okay, so to sort of bring this closer to close, what I want to do is talk about how I think the DevOps world and the SRE world overlaps and where I think one can borrow from the other. So, DevOps, SRE, middle space, right? Everybody cool? So here's what I think is in the middle space. I think the first thing that is very well shared between both places is this focus on measuring and monitoring. In the SRE world, monitoring and measuring is key because if you don't do it well, you can't have that shared understanding of, for your error budgets and et cetera, of just how reliable were you. You have to have something that everybody agrees is solid and is an absolute source of truth that you can both point at. DevOps 2 also has this notion that says, if you can't measure it and you're not measuring it, you have no idea whether it's actually up. You have no idea how well you're doing. Did you improve things? I don't know. I have no measuring. I have no monitoring. You know, and that was actually one of the things, if you go listen to some of Mikey Dickerson's talks about how the SRE world intersected with healthcare.gov, one of the things they walked in and the first thing they realized is there was no real good monitoring. And it's really surprisingly hard to know how well you're doing if you are not monitoring things well. I think we can all very much agree on the purpose of automation. It is the case that it is not possible to scale up any sort of thing by just adding more people. People do not scale linearly, or maybe if you scale people linearly, you still don't get the scale that you want out of your systems. I think we all agree on that. That's pretty easy. And the other thing I think that everybody agrees on is that there is, just like Nell said, there's the shared responsibility between both sides of the aisle that says, you know, we are both all responsible for making this product work well, and that the dev folks have a responsibility to pay attention to the operational aspects, and the operation people have a responsibility to understand how the stuff that the people that are making software are doing it and what's involved in that. Now, here's where I get a little slightly more controversial as I head towards the end. The question is, what could we add, what can DevOps add over to the SRE side of the house, and what can the SRE side of the house add into DevOps? So, in my opinion, one of the things that I really like about DevOps is there's a very strong culture around sharing. I think it's safe to say that you can say that your tool isn't done or what you've done isn't done until you've been able to share it, until it's up on GitHub, until it's out there and other people can use it and make use of your work. I think that you know, in a public way, and I think that's a phenomenal thing that I'd love to see more happen in the SRE world. I think that the DevOps folks have a better sense of how to deal with legacy environments because they have to. There's not as much greenfield stuff. They understand sort of what it's like on the ground. To a certain extent, I think that the SRE folks have some of that when they eat another company, but it is not nearly as embedded in their culture of like, what do I do about the fact that some people at this company aren't as competent as other people, some parts of our infrastructure aren't as reliable as other parts, how do we handle that? And I think that the DevOps folks have worked on that pretty well, and they've done it in a way around this people stuff. And similarly, I think that it is the case that in most SRE organizations, they have really good top engineering talent because they're into that and they can pay that and they can do that. And as a result, it isn't the case that the storage system is going to go down or this is going to go down or that sort of stuff. It isn't the case that they're as used to dealing with a situation where you can't trust the stuff below you in the stack. Where I think that in the DevOps world, we have a very good understanding of what happens when that goes on. Okay, now what can we get into the DevOps world from SRE, in my opinion? First thing is that one of the key focuses on in SRE is engineering failure out of the system. It's all about engineering. This is cool. Time is good. the goal is to engineer the failure out. Where is the failure and what can I do about that? And this emphasis on engineering and doing systems level stuff, I think, is really kind of key and useful, and we should bring that further in. Because though I said a moment ago that I think that DevOps folks feel it's not done until it's shared and is up on GitHub, I think that SRE folks feel it's not done until it's out in production and being used by millions of people, or at least some large amount of people. And that focus, I think, is really key. It's not that it's just on GitHub, it's actually out there and it's really, really pulling its weight. I think error budgets are cool, and I'd love to talk to you about in great detail later. I think that blameless postmortems are very cool, and I think, as I said, I think that's coming more into the DevOps world. And if you're not doing postmortems, I really want to talk to you, because I think that that's something that will really, to my mind, make your world a lot better. And here's another one that's also kind of strange that I didn't talk very much about. I think there's some brilliant work being done right now, Netflix I'll call out, in terms of failure engineering and failure injection, or chaos engineering, where the notion is, well, one way we can figure out what happens when our systems fail is to intentionally inject failure into it, or inject it in a way where we can find out how failure travels through our systems. I think that's some really brilliant, interesting work. Okay, so congratulations. I've given you a whole bunch of ideas I hope to think about between the two groups. I'd really like to see there's more mixing of this sort of thing. I'd like to see more mixed dancing going on. And with that, I think what I want to do is say thank you very much and take any questions that you might have about this sort of stuff. Thank you.
Error budgets seem really cool. How do you enforce them?
So the answer to the question is error budgets are really cool. In order for that to work, there has to be the political will in the organization, is the short version. You have to have it so that the political will upstream says, yes, we have come, everybody has sat down and agreed very strongly as to what the SLA is. We've all agreed it. It's down on paper. We've spent a lot of time and we're in full agreement. And given that, this is the expectation once we've set up your SLAs. Okay, and if they start to say, well, I didn't really mean that, then the actual exercise isn't useful at all. So that's my opinion, is that it's all the work up front that makes error budgets possible. And it's not easy to figure out what it is, how reliable can something be. I'm not saying that that's like a super easy process. You walk into the room, 10 minutes later, somebody gives you a number, they put it in an envelope, they slip it under the table, and now you have the number as to what your reliability can be. That's not the way it has to work. It's probably a good, long technical discussion. And there are processes for doing that sort of stuff.
I didn't fully understand the engineering failure out of production. So maybe you could explain that a little bit. That was my question.
So I think that one of the focuses on SREs is to spend a lot of your time figuring out how things fail. So one way you can help, one example that's an easy one that comes out of it, is that you can do a bunch of load testing and a bunch of stress testing on the software that's about to go out. So you know at what point it's going to fail and how it fails. And once you can do that, then you can do things around capacity planning and stuff like that you wouldn't do if you were just, versus I think I'll put it in production and, oh, look, it fell over when I had 2 of them. I think I should put a 3rd one there. The idea is to do honest to goodness real engineering work to make sure that you find out where things are going to fail and how, and that you plan for that. There are other things you can do along these lines, including making sure that you're doing the right thing about rate limiting, making sure you're doing the right things about how your service retries if things fail. It's a whole lovely set of things, and I would point you at that book, or we can chat about it later. So that's just like examples of trying to pay attention to the failure aspect and how things fail is, I think, the short version of the answer that I would give.
So I'm hearing the SRE first time. So my question is it typical to have DevOps and SRE as 2 separate groups, or is it once the DevOps implements some of the SRE practices, it chooses into an SRE?
So my experience is that an environment that has both SREs and DevOps like both of the titles very much and hope that they can hire people because the titles exist. I think that on the whole they are at the moment pretty much they don't contradict each other, but I think it is that you buy into one philosophy or the other, or you started along these lines. I've seen places that have both, but in those places I've seen both, I've looked at the actual job descriptions and thought, I don't get it. I don't get how these things. I think that the thing is just like DevOps, SRE is also going through this period of time where people are like, that's cool. Google does it. It's cool. If I put it on the title, then people will want to come work here, and that's not real SRE in my opinion. So I agree. So you were saying it should be part of everybody's responsibility. I would agree. And there doesn't say that you can't be DevOps and you say, hey, I like this idea of error budgets. I'm going to bring it into my world. And if at the end of the day or at the end of the month or at the end of the quarter, your team is doing stuff that more resembles what the traditional SRE definition is, awesome. So, to a certain extent, it's not like it's one or the other, and it's not like it has to be a flash cut. I'm just saying that I've not seen it. I've not seen job descriptions of that in a company that I have believed were correct when people have both in their organization.
Hi, a quick question about that intentionally injecting failure in the system that you gave. Can you elaborate a little more? Is it just the negative testing or beyond that?
Is it just the what testing?
Negative testing.
Are you saying what happens if you mean load testing until something falls over?
Yes.
It's a lot more than that. So the way that Netflix started to do this stuff, when it came to things like chaos engineering, was they said, what would happen if we wrote a piece of software that would randomly kill stuff in our environment? And what would happen if we ran something that would randomly kill an entire data center? And what happens if we kill an entire zone? So that was their first shot at this chaos. The Simian army is what they called it. Chaos Monkey, Chaos Kong. I'm missing one in there as well. Chaos. There was at least one other one's there. But they've also done some really interesting things where they attempt to inject latency or failure into part of their system. So if you look at their system, they do things, lots of little bits of things that talk to each other. They were like the original microservices universe, right? Where they had lots of things. This thing talks to that, this thing talks to that. And so the question is, what happens if something upstream to you starts to have failures? What if I inject some failures there? How does that ripple down to the rest of your system? And how do I do it in a way such that the components can pass information back and forth to say, well, this is failing. Well, the thing downstream knows that it's got to do something different because upstream failed, and in a way that they can communicate about failure. And to my mind, that's like brilliant work, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they're going to do next. And other people are doing stuff like that as well, and it's worthwhile paying attention. There's some great blog posts on the Netflix tech blog you should check out. So. Well, thank you all for listening to me, and thank you all to the organizers who do so much work to make this happen. I really appreciate it.
Too disturbing for children.